Hi everyone, my name is Alexander Zalivako, and I'm the founder of From A to Z law firm. One of the areas of our expertise are sanctions, and in a series of presentations called Sanctions 360 Degrees, we will look into major sanctions economic regimes and the way they affect the lives of private individuals and corporations. Thank you very much for watching. In today's presentation, we would expand the geographical reach of our series, Sanctions 360, and we would look into the major sanctions programs which are applicable to Yemen and are relevant to consider by those persons who are trading in Yemen, which is relevant even despite the current very complex and difficult situation in the country, resulting from civil war ongoing there for more than 10 years. Nevertheless, there is still substantial trading, for example, agricultural goods and medicine with the country, in part to alleviate the humanitarian catastrophe, which is ongoing in Yemen, and in part to supply agricultural commodities as a substantial number of population, including children, are suffering from hunger. And certainly, Yemen is at the heart of international trade. More than 12% of international trade actually flows through the Red Sea and then to the Gulf of Aden, basically at the Yemen's frontier. So this is a country which is relevant for the business today. And we would do what we typically do in our geography-related presentations. We look at the country main points from the sanctions perspective to understand the background to international and national sanctions programs against the country, as well as the major military and political players which are targeted by the sanctions and the reasons for doing so. And then we would briefly look at the international sanctions which are currently in place with respect to Yemen, as well as national sanctions programs, focusing on the most comprehensive being the US sanctions program. So let us first look at the country from the sanctions perspective to better understand the relevant restrictions applicable to the country. Yemen has been divided for a long period of time, both historically, religious-wise, as well as politically. In effect, the country reunified only in 1990, and before that, since its independence after the Second World War, there were two Yemen countries, with the North Yemen, which is largely a Shia country, and during the colonial rule ruled by the Ottoman Empire, and the South Yemen being a Sunni practicing community occupied by the British Empire. Nevertheless, although the conflict in Yemen is often portrayed as a Sunni-Shia divide, it would be a bit simplistic to position it in this way, as for a long period of time, both communities have peacefully coexisted, and this is evidenced in the reunification of the country, which occurred in 1990. Nevertheless, as the multiple political and economic problems existed, including the rule of President Saleh, who was reported to be engaged in corruption and generally inefficient politics. In 2011, with the Arab Spring, Yemen also rose up against its government with the general popular demands of reform, transparency, more efficient government, fight against corruption. This Arab Spring in Yemen has, to a said effect, the result of the civil war, as the Houthi movement, originally a student-based movement demanding reforms, took this general dissatisfaction with the government as an opportunity to step up its military campaign, which has been going, in essence, in one form or another since 90th, so for a very long period of time, by 2011. So the Houthi movement took the opportunity to step up their military fight against the government and overthrow the government. And they were very successful during this period of time, in essence, taking the capital, Sana'a, in less than 3 years, and then basically advancing to the port city of Aden. In essence, over 4 years, they managed to occupy and put under their control the territory of what was previously the territory of North Yemen. Given their success, as well as the general affiliation with the countries like Iran in the region, many countries in the Gulf, including, first of all, Saudi Arabia, but also United Arab Emirates, as well as Egypt, considered this advance of Houthis against the government of Yemen to be a threat to their national security, which also was corroborated by the attacks committed against petroleum installations in Saudi Arabia by Houthis. As a result of this, they interfered on the side of the government of Yemen, which in essence stopped the advance of Houthis southwise and eastwise. On this map, we can see the rough territories of Yemen currently controlled by various groups. We can see here in light yellow the territories controlled by government, then in orange Houthi-controlled territories. But we can see that the country is not just the result of the fight between these two factions. There is something which is called the South Transition Council in the violet, which in essence also strives for its independence, as well as territories controlled by Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. All in all, since the Arab Spring, unfortunately, the country derailed into a civil conflict, which, with one form of intensity or the other, has been ongoing up until recently. And it only stepped up with the Hamas attacks in Israel, which was supported by Houthis, and the escalation of that regional conflict into what is now the global conflict, as following that attack, Houthis started to target international vessels passing through the straits of the Red Sea and then into the Gulf of Aden. And as a result of these, various powers like the United States or the UK interfered and conducted military strikes and missile strikes against Houthis. So we in essence see the country which is torn by war and by conflict, but nevertheless, for the reasons we set up at the beginning of this presentation, is important, is critical for efficient international trade, as well as given the substantial humanitarian issues in the country, is relevant for many agricultural businesses trading in commodities, as well as those businesses which provide pharmaceutical and medical relief for the region. In essence, the country is relevant not just for political elite and those persons whose primary job is to take care of international peace and security, as well as terrorism threat, but also for regular business, primarily in the areas which I've just discussed. This makes the current state of regulatory risks of dealing with the region, sanctions risks, relevant for many persons, and we will try to briefly touch upon them in this presentation. Sanctions against Yemen globally are largely UN-driven. meaning that the relevant sanctions program has been adopted at the level of the UN Security Council and then is implemented into the national legislation of the UN member states. Multiple resolutions have been adopted by the UN Security Council, and they deal with 2 points: peace and security in the region, as well as the sanctions program itself. And I set here key resolutions which are relevant to understand the UN sanctions program, which is largely based on 2 pillars: asset freeze and travel ban for those persons who are involved in undermining peace and security in Yemen, human rights violations, violations of trade embargo, as well as sexual violence and children abuse in the armed conflict. That's one set of sanctions. We have individuals designated by the UN Security Council Sanctions Committee on its list for these type of actions. And the sanctions impose the freeze of those persons' assets within the United Nations member states, as well as the prohibition to provide to them any type of funds or economic resources, as well as a comprehensive travel ban subject to very limited exceptions. For the overview of the UN sanctions, please review our video, which was issued for this purpose. The targeted sanctions embargo against Yemen is another pillar of the UN sanctions program, and the embargo is targeted because it's not comprehensive. So there is no general prohibition to supply arms or military training for people of Yemen, of any kind of factions in Yemen. The UN sanctions embargo is directed primarily towards Houthis. So to the extent the relevant arms supplies or training is provided to the government, which is currently based in Aden, there is no prohibition to do so, which is often criticized on the basis that just one of the factions in the conflict is singled out, which represents a substantial part of the population and needs to be part of this process at the end of the day. Nevertheless, that's a feature of the embargo which needs to be considered. To the extent anything which is related to arms or training, which may enhance the military capacity, is provided, there is a prohibition at the UN level to do so, to the extent this could benefit Houthis or any companies or persons under their control. At the national level, we look at 3 major sanctions programs of US, UK, and the European Union. The national sanctions programs, as the member states are supposed to do, largely implement the UN sanctions related to the asset freeze of the persons designated by the UN Security Council's Committee, as well as the arms embargo with respect to trade with Yemen. And similar to the UN sanctions, those are largely sanctions which restrict trade with the Houthis controlled areas of Yemen or the persons controlled by them. There is one notable exception to this, which is the US sanctions program, which has as its part the UN implementation sanctions. But in addition to that, and that's the main part of the US sanctions program against Yemen, deals with it on the basis of its counterterrorism regulations. Specifically, the efforts along these lines have been stepped up since the issue by President Trump of its national security memorandum following the second term, where he specifically designated Houthis as a threat to the US security and to the trade, international trade in the region. And as a result of that memorandum, the measures taken by various US agencies towards the designation of Houthis, as well as various companies controlled by them and their networks outside of the region, have been stepped up. It's important to note that all those designations are largely made within the counterterrorism powers. The relevant authority is listed on the slide. And more specifically, Houthis themselves have been designated as a foreign terrorist organization, as well as specially designated global terrorists. The result of this is that, in essence, any dealings or any type of transactions provided for Houthis or the companies owned or controlled by them carry the risks of being designated by the US authorities on the blocking sanctions lists. Given the overall instability in the region, as well as difficulty to ascertain whether this or that company is controlled by Houthis, a very careful risk analysis is required for any person engaging with those territories which are believed to be under Houthis control, more specifically with the ports controlled by them, like data port, for example. And it's important that most of those measures are based on the specific authorizations issued by OFAC, or otherwise the relevant evidence is collected, which ensures that the persons who are the counterparties have no connections with Houthis in any sense or form. Then certainly it's important to know that these measures do not restrict the dealings with the globally recognized government of Yemen and the areas which are controlled by it, which is primarily for the international trade, is the port of Aden these days. Thank you very much for watching. I trust that you found this presentation useful, and I hope to see you during my next presentations.